Hello everyone, and welcome to Back Porch Chats. We're going to finish our discussion of symbolism in the novel. We have one more symbol to discuss, and it's an important one. It's where the novel gets its title, and that is the symbol of the mockingbird. So the idea of the mockingbird first comes up in chapter 10 when Atticus gives Jim and Scout their guns for Christmas. So follow along with me as I read. When he gave us our air rifles, Atticus wouldn't teach us to shoot. Uncle Jack instructed us in the rudiments thereof. He said Atticus wasn't interested in guns. Atticus said to Jim one day, "I'd rather you shoot at tin cans in the backyard, but I know you'll go after birds. Shoot all the blue jays you want if you can hit them. But remember, it's a sin to kill a mockingbird." That was the only time I ever heard Atticus say it was a sin to do something. And I asked Miss Maudie about it. "Your father's right," she said. "Mockingbirds don't do one thing but make music for us to enjoy. They don't eat up people's gardens, don't nest in corn cribs. They don't do one thing but sing their hearts out for us. That's why it's a sin to kill a mockingbird." So mockingbirds do good. They're for our enjoyment. And to kill a mockingbird, as Atticus points out, would be senseless cruelty. And that's what Atticus is saying would be sinful. This idea of senseless cruelty being sinful comes up a second time in our novel, in chapter 25. So if you'll turn with me to chapter 25, to the part where Mr. Underwood writes his editorial that appears in the Maycomb Tribune after Tom Robinson's death. Notice in this passage that he also says that something is sinful, but also notice that he links Tom Robinson to songbirds. So we have our first symbolic mockingbird in this particular paragraph. Mr. B.B. Underwood was at his most bitter, and he couldn't have cared less who canceled advertising and subscriptions. But Maycomb didn't play that way. Mr. Underwood could holler till he sweated and write whatever he wanted to. He'd still get his advertising and subscriptions. If he wanted to make a fool of himself in his paper, that was his business. Mr. Underwood didn't talk about miscarriages of justice. He was writing so children could understand. Mr. Underwood simply figured it was a sin to kill cripples, be they standing, sitting, or escaping. He likened Tom's death to the senseless slaughter of songbirds by hunters and children. And Maycomb thought he was trying to write an editorial poetical enough to be reprinted in the Montgomery Advertiser. How could this be so, I wondered, as I read Mr. Underwood's editorial? Senseless killing. Tom had been given due process of law to the day of his death. He had been tried openly and convicted by 12 good men and true. My father had fought for him all the way. Then Mr. Underwood's meaning became clear. Atticus had used every tool available to free men to save Tom Robinson, but in the secret courts of men's hearts, Atticus had no case. Tom was a dead man the minute Maila Ewell opened her mouth and screamed. So you see in this passage that Scout is struggling to understand why Mr. Underwood would call Tom's death senseless killing. But he does because it was cruel. And he says that Tom's death is likened to the slaughter of songbirds by hunters and children. Now, Scout struggles to understand this concept of senseless cruelty. Jim definitely gets it. And I want to point your attention to two small passages. We don't have time to turn to them, but one is in chapter 1. This is a passage where Dill, Jim, and Scout are figuring out how they can get Boo Radley to come out. And Jim says maybe they can force him out, and he talks about lighting a match under a turtle to get a turtle to come out of its shell. And the other children say, "Hey Jim, that's cruel. Don't do that." Now, Jim doesn't quite get it at that point in the book because what he wants is for Boo Radley to come out. But after the trial, he does seem to get this idea of meanness when he tells Scout not to mash or smash the roly-poly. So she's playing with this roly-poly, and I hope you guys know what a roly-poly is. We used to play with them all the time when we were kids. But she's playing with this roly-poly, and she goes to squash it. And he says, "Don't do that, put it out on the porch." And Scout gets her feathers ruffled a little bit because she thinks, why is he all of a sudden concerned about this insect? But I think what the scene shows is that Jim has grown in his understanding of cruelty, and he hates it like Atticus does. Scout, after Mr. Underwood's editorial, is beginning to understand, but by the end of the book, I think she's got it. So turn with me, if you will, to chapter 30, the end of chapter 30. Where Hecate is explaining to Atticus why he's not going to allow Boo Radley to take the spotlight and be the big hero for having saved Jim and Scout. Hecate says at the end of chapter 30, "To my way of thinking, Mr. Finch, taking the one man who's done you and this town a great service and dragging him with his shy ways into the limelight, to me, that's a sin. It's a sin, and I'm not about to have it on my head. If it was any other man, it'd be different, but not this man, Mr. Finch." So for a third time, we have someone saying it is a sin to do something, and here Hecate says it would be a sin with Boo Radley being the way he is to drag him into the spotlight. Scout actually gets it this time. And when Atticus says, "Scout, can you possibly understand Mr. Yule fell on his knife?" Scout runs to him, hugs him and kisses him and says, "Yes, sir, I understand. Mr. Tate was right." Atticus disengaged himself and looked at me. "What do you mean?" "Well, it'd be sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it?" And I think Atticus is very pleased that his daughter understands and puts two and two together of what he's taught her in the past. She gets that it would be cruel to drag Boo into the spotlight. So Tom Robinson is a symbolic mockingbird. Boo Radley is a symbolic mockingbird. We know from Miss Maudie that mockingbirds do good. So how is it that Tom and Boo have done good? So if you think about Tom, he is a family man. He works hard. Mr. Link Dees speaks about his work ethic. He is a faithful member of First Purchase Church. Scout observes during the courtroom scene that Tom has manners as good as Atticus himself. So he contributes to his community in his own way. He does good in his community. Boo Radley is the same. He doesn't contribute in the way most Maycomb citizens do, but in his own way he does. He puts a blanket around Scout's shoulders the night of the fire. He mends and folds and leaves hanging over the fence Jim's pants. He leaves gifts for the children in the tree, and he saves Jim and Scout's lives. So in his way, he is an active participant in his community. He is a mockingbird that does good. Now, sadly, Tom Robinson is the symbolic mockingbird who is the victim of cruelty. Boo is the symbolic mockingbird who's protected from the cruelty. And I think the novel begs the question, what is it that protects, prevents senseless cruelty? And I would put to you that we have our answer in the very final chapter of the book, chapter 31. And I think the answer is knowing someone. And that answer seems to come to us in the transformation that happens in how Scout views Boo Radley. So if you remember, Scout walks Boo Radley home that night, and she stands on his porch, positioning herself in front of the window from which he would look out to see the neighborhood. and he sees life from his perspective. And she says, Atticus was right. One time he said, you never really know a man until you stand in his shoes and walk around in them. Just standing on the Radley porch was enough. So we have to remember that scene where Atticus tells Scout concerning her teacher, Miss Caroline, to get into her skin and walk around in it. That is what Scout is remembering here. And she is doing that by looking at the world from Boo's perspective, and she realizes Boo sees a lot. And that is how he has been able to know Jim and Scout. Again, at the very end of the book, when Atticus is tucking Scout in for the night, and she's very drowsy, and she's confusing dreaminess, sleepiness with reality in this book that Atticus starts reading to her. She says, and they chased him and never could catch him because they didn't know what he looked like. And Atticus, when they finally saw him, why, he hadn't done any of those things. Atticus, he was real nice. His hands were under my chin, pulling up the cover, tucking it around me. Most people are, Scout, when you finally see them. He turned out the light and went into Jim's room. He would be there all night, and he would be there when Jim waked up in the morning. So Scout is finally able to see Boo Radley. And when she does, when she looks at things from his perspective, he transforms from this childhood monster of her and Jim's imaginations into a man, into a human being, into a folk. Remember, Scout has said that folks are just folks. And Atticus reiterates here, most people are nice when you finally see them. And so Scout finally sees Boo, and Boo transforms for her. So it seems that the novel does indeed suggest that knowing someone is what prevents that cruelty. And keep in mind that after Tom's death, Scout comments on the way Maycomb reacts, and she says he wasn't Tom to them. In other words, they didn't know him as Tom. They didn't know him as a human being. Had they, maybe their response would have been different. Maybe he would have received a fair trial. So Tom Robinson, a symbolic mockingbird, Boo Radley, a symbolic mockingbird, both of these teaching against senseless cruelty and teaching the necessity of knowing someone, of putting yourself in their position in order to grow your compassion and your understanding. I think this is the reason that Scout says at the end of the book, when she's on the Radley front porch, that she feels very old and feels like she doesn't have anything left to learn. She's learned the most important lessons in life. Compassion, understanding, and knowing people. So that concludes our discussion of the mockingbird symbol in the novel. And I'll see you next time. Thanks.